Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Tonight, we go into a village in the Oderbruch, into an inn with a shop in front of it and a garden behind it, in which an old pear tree stands. Under the Pear Tree by Theodor Fontane, published in the year 1885. It is the story of a crime in which we know from the very beginning who commits it. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried to the odor. In Chechen, a village in the Oderbruch. The house of the innkeeper and merchant Abel Hradscheck stood on the village street, the shop in front, the tap room behind, and beyond the yard a garden in which an old pear tree grew. It was autumn, the potatoes were coming out of the earth, and that morning Hradscheck sent his farmhand Jakob with the rapeseed sacks to the oil mill, for a buyer was waiting for the oil, and Hradscheck was waiting for the money. He was a stately man in his 40s, friendly to everyone, popular with the peasants, a gourmet and a friend of good table talk. In the garden he liked to stand with the spade, and there the neighbor found him too, old Mother Yeshka, who leaned at the hedge gate between the two gardens and watched him, as she always did. She spoke in hints, knew more about everyone in the village than he knew about himself, and let one feel it. Hradscheck answered her in the same tone, half in jest, and went back into the house. There his wife Ursel sat binding wreaths. It was the anniversary of the death of their children, who had both died young, and Hradscheck had forgotten the day. He was therefore not allowed to come with her to the churchyard. She went alone. Between the two there stood more than this one forgotten day. Ursel came from a Catholic family and had entered the marriage with demands that exceeded the house, good furniture, good clothes, a bearing that was ahead of that of an innkeeper's wife in the Oderbruch. Hradscheck had refused her nothing. He himself drank more of his own wine than the trade could bear, and when the guests sat at cards in the evening, he played along and lost. So the books stood as they stood. Ursel reproached him with it, and he did not even contradict her, for he knew it better than she did. Heaviest of all weighed a single debt. The wine came from the house of Olszewski and Goldschmidt in Krakow, and the firm had waited long. Now it had been announced that their traveler would come to settle accounts, a Herr Julski, young, elegant, little inclined to be put off. Hradscheck reckoned it up and arrived at no figure that would save him. The shop kept him busy, but in the quiet hours Hradscheck went into the yard and split wood, or he took the spade and worked in the garden, and these hours were the happiest of his day. The good table potatoes were out, and he began to dig over the narrow strip of land on which they had stood. In doing so, he found, close by the pear tree, something under the spade that was neither stone nor root. He dug on more carefully and laid bare bones, a whole skeleton, and by the bones lay the remains of a cloth coat, buttons, and a piece of leatherwork. Hradscheck did not need long to know what he had before him. 20 years earlier, the French had flooded back through the Oderbruch, and many of them had been left behind and buried quietly. A French soldier, then, long dead, missed by no one. Another man would have reported the find. Hradscheck threw the earth back over it, trod it firm, and said not a word to anyone, not even to his wife. For a dead man in the garden brings an inn into ill repute, and the peasants would no longer stop in with him. But while he carried the spade away, something else worked on within him. In his head there had lain for weeks a thought that he did not yet dare to call a plan, that all would be well if Julski did not come, or if he came and did not leave again. The traveler carried the firm's money with him, in cash, on his round through the villages. He knew no one here, and no one knew him. But a person who vanishes is searched for, and where there is searching, there is digging. On precisely this the thought had so far foundered. Now, Hradscheck had something in his hand that he had not had before. If one day someone dug in his garden, they would find what everyone should find: a dead man who had lain there for 20 years and had nothing more to do with any matter of this world. They would suspect him, they would dig, they would bring the Frenchman to light, and afterward no one would search at that spot again. The suspicion itself thereby became the surest part of the plan. Hradscheck went to sleep that evening more calmly than he had in a long time. He spoke with Ursel about it only later, and only so far as was necessary, and she listened to him without interrupting. What she thought, she did not say. She was a woman who feared hell and feared poverty, and poverty was nearer. On a dreary November day, Solski drove up. He was a young man in good cloth, talkative, with the loud politeness of people who want to get ahead in business, and he took the matter in a friendly way, but without yielding. Hradscheck invited him into the tap room, where that evening peasants sat at cards, and here he did what everyone in the village would later confirm. He paid. Before witnesses, he laid the money on the table, as much as he had scraped together, and Solski gave a receipt, and the two drank together and grew merry. One could hear it out in the hall. Later in the evening it was said that the gentleman from Krakow wished to travel on early the next morning to Berlin, and that the wagon already stood ready. The guests left. Jakob was with his parents in the neighboring village. The girl slept upstairs, and it grew still in the house. What happened that night in the tap room, no one saw. Hradscheck struck the traveler dead and took his money, his own and the firm's, everything Solski had collected on the round. Then he fetched his wife. Together the two carried the dead man down the cellar stairs to where the wine cellar formed a corner behind the barrel rack that no one entered, and there they buried him and smoothed the earth and rolled the barrels back in front of it. Ursel worked without saying a word, and her hands did not tremble. Only when they were upstairs again did she sit down and remain sitting. Outside it was still dark, and the plan was not yet at an end. For Solski had to depart, and it had to be seen. So Ursel put on the dead man's coat and cloak, set his cap on her head, and climbed into the wagon, and Hradscheck led the horse. They drove down the village street in the first gray, past the houses, and whoever stepped to the window at that hour saw a man in a traveling cloak on the box, leaving the village. They drove down to the Oder, where the road runs close by the water, and the bank in autumn is soft and washed out. There they made a misfortune out of a departure. The wagon was pushed down the embankment and smashed. The horse hung in the harness. Coat and cap drifted in the water. Ursel went back across the fields into the house. In the morning the whole thing was found and an alarm raised, and in the village it was said that the stranger had strayed from the road in the darkness and plunged into the Oder. They searched for him all day. Hradscheck searched too. They did not find him. The river stood high, and whoever falls into the Oder in November is given back by it only far downstream, if at all. So the people said, and so said the mayor Wojtasz too, a calm, just man who was reluctant to think ill of anyone. So for the moment it remained a misfortune, and Chechen would have forgotten the matter in a few weeks. There was, however, one who did not forget it. The gendarme Gilhar had an old dislike of Hradscheck, and out of this dislike a suspicion now grew. He reckoned up publicly what did not fit together for him. A traveler who was in the best of moods in the evening does not set out in the darkness when he can drive rested by daylight. A wagon that slides down the embankment does not break in this way. And above all, Hradscheck had not been able to pay his debts the day before the visit, and in the evening he had paid. Where, asked Gilhar, does money suddenly come from with a man who has nothing? The matter went to Kustrin, and from there came the counselor of justice Wałwinkel, a man who worked slowly and said little. He had the bank searched, the wagon remains examined, the horse assessed, and he questioned in the village everyone who could have seen anything. In doing so, one circumstance stuck. Several had seen the wagon drive in the early morning, and the man on the box had been the stranger, in the coat, with the cap. No one was sure, for it was dark, and no one had looked long. Another, though, had seen light burning in the innkeeper's house that same night, long after the guests were gone. Wałwinkel had Hradscheck brought before him, and Hradscheck answered well. He answered kindly, without haste, without talking himself into contradictions, and where he did not know something, he said that he did not know it. The money, he said, he had borrowed and saved together, because he had known that the Pole would not be reasoned with. And if an innkeeper burns light in the evening, he burns it because things must be tidied up. It was not enough. Wałwinkel took him into custody and had him brought to Kustrin. In the village, meanwhile, the mood turned. Some held to him, others suddenly knew for years that there was something not right about this Hradscheck. Ursel remained alone in the house, carried on the shop, and went to church, and whoever saw her said she had grown pale. Hradscheck sat and he waited well. He slept, he ate what was brought to him, and when Wałwinkel had him fetched, he kept to what he had said. The counselor of justice got no further. There was no dead body. There was no weapon. There was no witness of the deed, and a man who pays an old debt is not yet a murderer. What Wałwinkel lacked was a reason to dig. That was supplied to him by Mother Jeschke. Gielhar took the old woman for questioning, and because she feared the gendarme and because she liked to tell what she knew anyway, she came out with what she had until then only hinted at. That night, when the Pole had been in the house, she had not been able to sleep and had looked out the window, and over in the Hradscheck's garden someone had stood and dug by the pear tree in the dark. With that, Wałwinkel had what he needed. They came with men and spades, cordoned off the garden, and half the village stood at the fences. They dug under the pear tree, and they found. There lay a dead man in the earth, but when they laid him bare, it was no dead man of a few weeks. It was a skeleton, bones without any flesh, and with it the remains of a uniform, buttons, leatherwork, such as the French had worn when they went back through the Oderbruch. The doctor who was called in said what everyone could see. This man had lain there for at least 20 years. They fetched Hradscheck from Kustrin, and he gave information willingly. Yes, he said, he had dug that night. A side of bacon had spoiled on him, and because he ran an inn and because people talk when something is spoiled, he had wanted to get rid of it in the dark rather than carry it across the yard by day. In doing so, he had struck the bones and been frightened and thrown everything back and kept silent, for who would want to stop in at a house in whose garden a dead man lies? That was an explanation one could live with, and it fit everything one knew of him. Wałwinkel closed the investigation. Hradscheck went free and drove back to Czechen, and in the village the mood turned. They had suspected a respectable man, and that was embarrassing. On the following Sunday, Pastor Achilles climbed into the pulpit and preached a sermon on the 8th commandment and on what false witness does in a community. And as he did so, he looked in the direction in which the Jeschke sat. After that, Hradscheck was restored.
For Hradscheck, a good time began. The debts were gone, the business ran, the guests came again, and one could see it on him. He grew rounder in the face. He laughed in the taproom. He played cards, and even won at times. And whoever asked him about the Kustrin affair got an answer one could laugh at. He slept soundly. One might have thought that a man who has struck another dead and knows him in his own cellar lies awake at night. But Hradscheck did not lie awake. What had happened, and since it could not be undone, he settled into it.
With Ursel, it was the other way around. She had been calm that night, calmer than he, and afterward, she never was again. At first, she only went to church more often than before. Then she began to avoid the cellar. She sent the girl down when wine had to be fetched, and when she had to go down herself, she came up again quickly. She ate little. She sat in the evening with her embroidery at the window and did not stitch, but looked out. And she spoke with Acelius more often and longer than becomes a woman who has nothing on her heart. But what she said to him she never said entirely. She had grown up Catholic and would have confessed if she had still been allowed to. Now there remained to her a Protestant pastor who spoke to her kindly and offered her comfort for a matter of which he knew nothing. Hradscheck saw it coming and could do nothing. He was at times rough with her out of fear, at times tender out of the same fear, and once he told her she would yet bring them both to ruin if she went on like this. Then she only looked at him. In the spring, she took to her bed. The doctor from Kustrin found nothing that had a name, spoke of weakness and of the nerves, and prescribed what one prescribes in such cases. She grew smaller in her bed, she prayed much, and when Hradscheck came into the room, she grew uneasy. She died in the autumn without having said anything. Acelius gave her a fine graveside speech, and in it reckoned up for the village once more that this woman had perished from the talk that had been spread about her house. And he named the old woman almost by name. Half the village wept. Hradscheck walked behind the coffin, and the people found that he held himself very upright. After the funeral, the mourning did not last long. Hradscheck lived more sociably than ever, drove at regular intervals to Frankfurt and to Berlin to do business, and went to the theater there. From these trips he brought back songs and arias which he performed for his regulars, for he had a good tenor voice, and the evenings in the tap room grew long. In Berlin he also found something else. Editha, 30 years old, daughter from a distilling business, who was not disinclined to his marriage plans. He spoke of it to no one in the village yet, but he was already reckoning. A new beginning with a young woman, perhaps in a city, in any case, away from Tschechien. On one of these merry evenings, the wine ran out, and Hradscheck sent the shopboy Ede down. Ede came back without wine. He would not go into the cellar, he said, before all the guests. It was haunted there. The peasants laughed, and Hradscheck laughed along and went down himself, but at the table the remark stayed lying. They asked who claimed such a thing, and the boy said what the whole village knew anyway. Old Jeschke said it. From then on, it did not leave him. He met the old woman at the fence, and she spoke as always in hints, of dreams she had had, of lights in the house, and of the fact that some things do not want to stay lying where one puts them. Hradscheck snapped at her harder than he meant to, and threatened her. That was a mistake, and he noticed it in the same instant, for the old woman looked at him and now knew exactly where she stood. She went into the house and left him standing. In the evening, Hradscheck sat alone in the room and reckoned the matter through. As long as the pole lay under his cellar, he was bound to this house. Sell it he could not, for a new owner would rebuild and dig. Stay he could not either, with an old woman at the fence who talked and a boy who no longer dared to go down. There was only one thing. The dead man had to leave the house. The odor ran not 1,000 paces away. It was high this autumn, and what it took, it did not give back. The next night, when everyone slept, he meant to do it. He waited until the house was still. Then he took the lantern and the spade and climbed down into the cellar.
went behind the barrel rack into the corner where, for 2 years, no one had had anything to look for, and began to dig. The earth went easily. He got deeper, faster than he had thought, and then the pole lay before him, so close that he could have grasped him. What still happened in that hour, no one saw. While working, he must have knocked against a barrel, and the barrel began to roll and laid itself in front of the cellar exit, and Hradscheck stood in his own cellar and could no longer get up. Whether he called out, whether his heart struck him, whether the air gave out on him, or the fear, could not be established. The next morning, the servants found him. He lay beside the half-dug-up corpse of the Pole, and with that, everything came out for which the Counselor of Justice, Fauwinkel, had found not a single proof 2 years before. In the village, they spoke of nothing else. Pastor Ecelius, who had admonished the people of Czekin from the pulpit because they had spoken ill of an innocent man, and who had said over Ursul's coffin that she had perished from precisely this talk, now had to recognize how greatly he had been deceived in both. He did not want to give Hradscheck a grave in the churchyard. Only the mayor, Wojtasz, talked him round, and Ecelius gave in. Wojtasz also foretold the other thing, that Ursul's grave would be desecrated once it came out what she had done, and that one would have to let it happen, because the village would take its right anyway. Against that, too, the pastor in the end raised no objection. So the one lay in the cellar under the house until they brought him up, and the others lay in the churchyard. And in the garden stood the pear tree, under which a French soldier had been buried, whom for 20 years no one had missed, and who, in the end, accomplished more than any witness. That was our short retelling of Under the Pear Tree by Theodor Fontane. A man reckons everything through, thinks of every trace and every suspicion, and overlooks only that he will have to live with what he has done. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.